Hello everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Brittany and I want to welcome you all to the SQL Server 2012 First Looks Showcase. First, we'll talk about a couple optimization tools, then I'll introduce our speaker, Stephen Allen, and he'll take over and give his presentation. We'll then have Frank Chow talk about Quick Start and show some of our SQL Server 2012 classes, and we'll also have Q&A for any questions you might have for Stephen or Frank. We will have a closing survey that will be emailed to you by Friday. Once you fill out the survey, you'll receive the recording of this seminar. Like I said, the seminar is being recorded and it will be emailed to you after you take the survey. To optimize your experience during this seminar, feel free to ask questions by clicking on the message icon and typing in at the box at the bottom left. If Stephen sees that your question is one that he can answer without going too off topic, he'll answer as he's presenting. Otherwise, Stephen will answer any other questions at the end during Q&A. If you don't want to see the chat section, go ahead and click the X at the top of the message box. You can also view the screen in full screen by clicking the icon at the bottom right. I'll now hand it over to Stephen Allen, who is one of QuickStart's own instructors, and he'll give his presentation on SQL Server 2012. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's had a nice, relaxing morning. Ready to learn something about SQL Server 2012. As Brittany introduced, my name is Stephen Allen. I am a trainer at Quick Start. I have been teaching SQL Server classes, SharePoint Server classes, Windows Server classes for 10 and a half years. Almost all aspects of SQL Server. I have been using SQL Server since version 6.5, teaching on it since SQL Server 2000, and have been teaching and using SQL Server 2012 since before it was released to manufacturing. As Brittany said, again, if you guys have questions, feel free to put them into the chat. If it pertains to the topic, I will try to answer it then. If it's something that's going to take a much longer answer or doesn't pertain, I will probably push that off to the question and answer period. So SQL Server 2012. I was asked to talk about things like what's new in 2012, availability, cloud computing, that type of thing. Where's Microsoft's vision for where they're taking their product? So I've got a quick, I've got one slideshow we're going to go through here that's going to give us a high-level view of all of the new features, and then I'll drill down into some detailed topics from there. All right, so our agenda for the for this first section here is we're going to look at the new platform options Microsoft offers that are part of the SQL Server 2012 wave of products, as they call it. We'll talk about some of the data platform requirements, give us an overview of all the new features in 2012, and we're going to go from there. All right. There you go. All right. Now, one of the key things that Microsoft is trying to create with SQL Server 2012 is to give us additional options for how we want to deploy SQL Server. So the sharing stopped. Okay, let me reshare that. How's that? You guys able to see the screen now? Is the screen visible now, guys?
Yes, it is, Stephen. We can see it.
Perfect. All right. So as I was saying, one of Microsoft's goals with SQL Server 2012 is to give us more options for how we can use it, how we can deploy SQL Server 2012. We've had in the past what they're calling the self-managed platform, where your IT department or your server administrators are going to manage the whole stack here, from the core networking to your storage, whether it's in the server or storage area network, your servers, maybe virtualization, all your operating systems, the database itself, and then your applications, the middleware, the data, and so on. So that we still have that model in SQL Server 2012. We can do it all self-managed. And then they're looking at infrastructure as a service. We've had this for the last decade or so, where we can go out and get SQL Server, purchase SQL Server hosted by a provider that is hosting SQL Server for us. Now, they may be using virtualization, they may not, but that has always been an option. We could get dedicated servers, we could get databases running on those servers. Microsoft is starting to make available this third option here, platform as a service. They kind of started with SQL Server 2008 with the SQL Azure platform, where Microsoft is offering SQL Azure. And what that is managed services from the networking, storage, server, virtualization, the operating system itself, your runtime, server-hosted database level, and then their customers would just manage their applications that are using that database and manage the data in the database. And then by database here, we're really referring to managing the creation of the database, the backups, the restores of the database. We're not really talking about the database structures, the tables, the indexes, etc. That is what they mean by data. And then software as a service, where the whole thing is a managed service. And that they want to make sure that SQL Server is available for customers to choose any of these models. And so they made a lot of steps here in the platform and software area. That's the whole marketing push you'll see about SQL Server 2012 around cloud computing. There are some other features that kind of help deal with that, manage with that, partially contain databases and such that we're going to talk about as we go through this morning. Now, Microsoft sees some key areas where they want to provide parts of SQL Server. Storage and search. So comprehensive search, and you'll see that as we've got new types of search, the new statistical semantic search. And we'll be very flexible there. Allow federation with multiple servers and security between those. Composition, insights. Insights is their word for business intelligence. Deliver through all of these methods on device, on premise. That'd be the fully managed, partner hosted, Microsoft hosted. That's the platform as a service and application as a service. And make programmability much easier. So on the self-managed side, .NET platform, SQL Server, Windows Server, where we're managing those ourselves. On the platform as a service, we've got SQL Azure, Windows Azure, and the .NET framework on that side. Again, coming back to what we saw over here, where we've had platform as a service, or platform as self-managed, right? That is this side here, SQL Server, Windows Server, .NET, and then the platform as a service, those on the right. Key components of SQL Server 2012. This is a high-level overview, the 30,000-foot view, where we're pointing out kind of the major features, which ones have been improved in SQL Server 2012. So both SQL Server, in terms of the database engine itself, most components of it have been improved, updated SQL Server Management Studio, Service Broker, some replication has not been improved, but most of the other components of the database engine has. New improvements to SQL Server Azure and the SQL Server Azure Data Sync tool. Full text and semantic search. Semantic search is an entirely new feature that's built on top of full text searching. That's, as we'll talk a little bit more about this, but the basic feature here is that it enables statistical matching between files. So here's a file, find other files that are similar, and tell me where and how they're similar. So that's on the database engine side itself. Then we've got our data integration services. The rest of this kind of fits into the business intelligence area, which has been a huge market for Microsoft. And we've seen that ourselves at Quick Start. Our business intelligence classes are some of our most popular classes. So Microsoft's put a lot of effort into upgrading and changing and making the business intelligence even more useful than it's been in the past. So we have some key upgrades to integration services, analysis services, and reporting services, and those are three of the topics that I'm going to go into greater detail as we go through this morning. Master data services and data quality services. Two services that were introduced in SQL Server 2008 R2 back 3 years ago in 2010, that, yeah, we could use them, but some ways, I mean, it was a first version, and there are some rough edges to them. They've really been improved and stepped up where we can actually use these and have business analysts using these and all of that. Master data services, for those of you who don't know what that is a tool that's meant to help take similar data from many of your transaction systems or OLTP systems and consolidate into an authoritative master set, right? We may have a customer in a marketing database, application database. We might have a customer in a sales database, a customer in a finance database system. And they'll have slightly different definitions, perhaps, but more common, if we're entering this data in all these different systems, there's a very high chance that that data is not synchronized. That the address is wrong. Like if marketing got a new address but didn't tell sales, or vice versa, sales got the new address and marketing database wasn't updated. So master data services is meant to help you create a central definition for those types of things that may exist in many databases. Maintain that authoritative, here's our single version of the truth for that entity, and publish those out to those other applications. And as I said, the improvements really make that feasible and possible. Now, data quality services kind of goes hand in hand with master data services and integration services. It's about cleansing and deduplicating your data, often as a result of a data warehouse project, where accuracy that we're going to load into a data warehouse and analysis services is very critical. But it can also feed back into, okay, now we've identified this as a single customer, we've deduplicated those, and we've cleansed and checked the data for accurate addresses, accurate names, accurate whatever the data is. Now we're going to load that into master data services. So these integration services, master data services, data quality services often work hand in hand to make sure that. All right, guys, let me also try re-sharing my presentation for those who started late. And sometimes that will trigger that sharing to come through. The last component of the data integration services is Stream Insight. Now, Stream Insight is kind of an interesting product. It was introduced into SQL Server 2008 R2 and is meant to give us a rapid data processing engine when we don't need every event that may be occurring in our systems or applications to be recorded into a database. Several examples of how Stream Insight can help often involve the thing called what's called the Internet of Things. Can't be more specific than that because we're talking an internet of objects that are not necessarily computers. They're smartphones, they're refrigerators, they're the thermostat in your house, the water meter, all these devices that may end up being connected to the internet. And say your power company or your water company may be getting telemetry from those meters, those oil and gas pipeline is another great example where they might be getting data every second or fractions of a second from their switches and their sensors and all that, and they want to respond to those events. And well over 99% of the time, those events are everything's okay. There's no problem. There's no problem. But then when there is a problem, then we need to take an immediate response to that. Well, in the traditional database model where we have an application, an event occurs, we write it into the database as a transaction, and there's some latency there, and then we can read that back out of the database into our application. All right, and then we can take some action. We can report on it and take some action. That latency may not be acceptable. You may need a faster response. One example where Microsoft used this Stream Insight was they had worked with, I think it was NBC, on the last Summer Olympics and streaming events on the internet. And they had built into their player, their web video player, to send telemetry back to Microsoft so they could do things like monitor, okay, how frequently is this video being watched? What's the performance of the video? Right? Are we being saturated with bandwidth? And then using that data through the Stream Insight to very quickly identify trends. We're getting excessively high demand, or we're dropping, which dynamically adjust the quality of the video. So maybe each transmission takes less data. So they've done things like that. So that's the Stream Insight. They've made some improvements over 2008 R2 that make it even easier to work with. On the analysis services side, we have some improvements mostly around updates to Power Pivot and the new tabular project model. That's kind of the biggest thing. So again, Power Pivot and analysis service tabular project. We do not have any updates to data mining. They do not change anything in data mining. Reporting services. So very, very briefly on reporting services, there's 3 new features. The 3 features were better SharePoint integration, meaning it gets deployed as almost a fully packaged service application now in the SharePoint architecture. We get a new feature called Data Alerts. Data Alerts allows users to set up an event. So here's a report. On that report, say, is our weekly or monthly or daily, it depends what's in the report, a daily percent profit margin, or sales calls per customer contacts per day. Whatever that metric that we're interested in, or that user's interested in, they can say, all right, I want to be notified when that value goes above a certain amount, or is equal to a certain amount, or drops below a certain amount. And reporting services will periodically check that report, and if that condition is true, then it will fully render that report and send the user through the standard reporting services subscription system a copy of that report. It says, hey, your data alert condition has been met. And then the other big feature of reporting services is PowerView. PowerView is a reporting tool from reporting services. Yes, Paul, we're still on this one slide. We're about to go to the next one. Is a new feature that is part of reporting services, requires SharePoint, as does Data Alerts. Both those new features require SharePoint. Microsoft is really moving SharePoint to be the central distribution point for all their business intelligence. And PowerView is targeted for ad hoc reporting by users who don't know a lot about data, but may know some about the business. Right now, that requires a Power Pivot or Tabular Project data source, but the first service pack for SQL Server 2012, due out soon, will extend PowerView so that users can use it against an analysis service's full multidimensional queue. All right, so a little bit more detail here on the database engine. Changes. This one was interesting when we first learned about it. You can now store your databases. Your active databases that SQL Server is hosting, you can put those on a file share. And they can be hosted off of a file share. You know, when I first heard that, and I was in a developer preview for SQL Server 2012, and the entire room was like, what? Why would you ever want to do that? Networking is so slow. Well, it was. The server message block protocol from Microsoft, historically not the most efficient network protocol. But Microsoft made changes in the Windows 8 and Server 2012 infrastructure that significantly improved your SMB support. And in their internal testing, running on Server 2012 through a Server 2012 storage space, shared folder, they had less than, assuming you had a significant or enough network bandwidth, less than 1.5% performance hit. And it enabled certain scenarios of database availability. New UTF-16, database character support. They increased table and index partitioning from 1,024 partitions to 15,000 partitions that you can create. Brings it up to par with Oracle now in terms of partitioning. Made improvements to FileStream in terms of its performance and its access. FileStream is a technology, if you're not familiar with it, that allows you to store your binary large objects, documents, out in the file system, in the NTFS file system, taking advantage of file streams that are native to NTFS, storage improvements, but keeping the management of those files inside of SQL Server. So when you back up the database, it backs up those files. When you set permissions on the rows, it's going to control permissions through SQL Server. Full transactional support in SQL Server. Now, that did require some application changes, programming changes, and was really focused from a database perspective. File table is a new feature here in 2012 that allows you to just create this file table, which hooks to a folder as part of the file stream. And you can just drag and drop files into and out of the file table. And those are loaded into SQL Server. Louisa, they are working, they are recording that, so that will be available later. So for scenarios where you primarily want to have the files in SQL Server to take advantage of full text indexing and the new statistical semantic searching, you don't have to load them through the database. You can just copy them into this file. But we can access them from either way. So that's an improvement there. Spatial data types. So they made a couple improvements. One for performance, another to a whole new set of functions that give you more options for how to get closest. There's more options for, okay, what is the closest distance mean? Or rounded curves when you're asking for distances from polygons. Or I've got a bunch of polygons in my spatial data, and I want to consolidate a polygon that incorporates everything. And it can even fill in areas if you ask it to. Analysis services, they increase the OLAP string store limit to 4 gigabytes from 2. There's the new tabular server mode, which takes the Vertipack, which is now called the X-Velocity engine, that PowerPivot uses, but deploys it into a server architecture. So where you might be limited by file size or client size of memory where you're running Excel on PowerPivot, you can take that same PowerPivot object model, semantic model, and publish it to a server running server hardware and gain some options. You can actually just import that PowerPivot workbook into it. But it also gives us your data administrators, that there's server administrators who understand tables, but not necessarily dimensions and facts and measures and measure groups and all the stuff that go into a multidimensional cube. They may not have that skill set to build and design that, but they understand tables and can add a few concepts and very quickly deploy models for reporting, BI semantic models for reporting, that they couldn't do before. That can scale much larger than even PowerPivot can. Indexing and search. A rather big improvement for data warehouses. So this is primarily going to be used in data warehouses, is the new column store index technology. Column store indexes allow you to create a column store index. Let me explain how that works. In a normal SQL Server table, you are going to have rows defined right? So you get your rows and columns. And what SQL Server does is what's called a direct image map. And as that row is defined, right? So here's our row. It's defined right here. As it's defined, it's going to store it exactly like that on disk. It's stored as a row on disk. If you have columns, this works best for numeric columns, where you're going to do a lot of aggregation, right? And if I have to do a group by on an aggregations on this column here, but in order to read that column, I have to read every column in the table, that's going to take a lot more disk and memory I/O than is necessary. So a column store index doesn't replace the table. What it does do is it says, all right, I want to take these columns and I want to store them as columns. And you can get very high compression with that, in addition to very high performance on aggregations. We'll talk more about column store index. That's one of the topics I'm going to go into greater detail on. They've made a few improvements to full text search, but the biggest change to search is this new statistical semantic search, where you're going to, it's meant to work with documents that are stored in the database through normal methods, through file stream, through file table, and it extracts key phrases. Full text search is mostly about keywords. Semantic search, this is about key phrases. And about key phrases, then that also means that it's trying to pull out the semantic meaning of the document and doing statistical analysis to determine that. And from that, then, you can discover similarities between documents. You can ask what documents are most similar to this document. So it's kind of like full text search, except we're using documents as our search term. What's similar to this document? What are the key phrases in the single document? What documents have similar key phrases? That type of thing. Federation. This federation is some of that new cloud, kind of trying to make SQL Server work better in the cloud. By one, giving us databases that don't depend on the SQL Server instance that they're in order for authentication. That we can actually create a user at the database level that can authenticate somebody connecting to that database, which enables us to move that database from one instance to another and still allow authentication to it. Again, one of the big benefits of cloud and virtualization is the ability to maximize resource usage by moving applications, instances, now databases, entire virtual servers to servers that have the appropriate resources to handle the load. And this is one of those tools enables that. It also helps support in high availability scenarios, where before you had to run jobs that periodically synchronize logins between SQL Server instances, or if you had a disaster and you had to rebuild a server, you may have to restore your master database first. Well, you may not want that extra time required. Let's just restore this database, get people accessing it right away. The data tier applications, which were sets of database objects that were part of an application that we could deploy. We can now capture permissions and database role membership and move those when we deploy those. Again, contained databases would be an entire database virtualization that we can move from instance to instance. The DAX, the data tier applications, are parts of a database. Or you might have a big database, transaction database, only some of it pertain to this HR application or this marketing application. You can develop and manage that as a unit and deploy those to different databases as necessary. You can now create something that I know people have been asking for 15 years. User-defined server roles. Right, for the longest time, all we had was the fixed server roles that Microsoft gives us. We had our user-defined database roles and our fixed database roles, and that was pretty much it. We could not create user-defined server roles. Now we can. Now we can. Not an issue there. Improved database default schema support for groups. So we can set up better default schema activity for groups rather than individuals. Improve security on the X-Velocity engine. It's part of that. For high availability, there's some really exciting things in the high availability area involving the always on. We've had various technologies, and I'm going to go into greater detail on this one later, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But we've had various technologies that duplicated databases, gave us entire instance failover or database failover. But we didn't have any tools that really mixed and gave us the best of all those things. Now we do. Always on availability groups give us some really nice functionality dealing with high availability. And if you're using Stream Insight, it has a new checkpoint support, which helps enable high availability scenarios. Resource utilization, we're going to talk about this in the always on, but we get these readable secondaries, much like log shipping could enable for us, but we don't have to stop reading those to apply transactions like we did with log shipping. Improved online operations. So online index operations give us better performance. For developers developing applications in their organization or to sell, there's this huge, really nice benefit, new feature. Local database runtime support in SQL Server Express. SQL Server Express had an amazing install. It had an exceptionally high success rate. Well over 99.9% of installs running the SQL Server Express installer were successful. However, it was installed on so many computers that installing SQL Server Express represented, and this is right from the Microsoft SQL Server team, it represented over 85% of all SQL Server support requests for scenarios where SQL Server Express could not be installed. They had problems installing it. So to help solve that, Microsoft said, all right, well, let's give us a way that we can run these without even having to do an install for the most part. And what you do is your application just starts up this local database runtime, this little executable, and connects and works with that. There's no separate installer. There's no service running in the background. It's the application can manage that database runtime itself, and so it doesn't have all those install dependencies, all of that, and developers now can develop their applications and debug and test and know that the database is going to work because there is no install. More federation to help us manage servers at scale. We get server core support. We can now run SQL Server, some of the components of SQL Server, on Windows Server Core. Before we had to run on the full server. Now we can run on Server Core. It means less resources need to be devoted to the operating system. A smaller security surface area. We're not running all that graphical code of the full operating system. So the database engine and I believe integration services are supported on Server Core. Reporting services too, I think, but you're going to want to verify that. And then set up support for slipstream upgrade. You can now slipstream service packs and cumulative updates together to apply as a group, right? We could have, in the past, created an install media where we said, here's our SQL Server install files, here's our service pack, here's our cumulative upgrade, do a slipstream upgrade, a slipstream of the files, so that when we do an install, we're installing to the cumulative update stage or the service pack stage, wherever it is we're restoring to. But what we could not do is if we already had SQL Server install, slipstream together service pack and cumulative updates together and deploy that update once. So the issue there was you might have a problem with your particular application, but with, say, a cumulative update 3, or with Service Pack 1 or Service Pack 2, there might have broken something in your application, but the cumulative update fixes it. Before, you had to go through that Service Pack stage and then apply the cumulative update. So there are longer periods of downtime there. In addition, you had to apply both updates. Now you can slipstream them, apply them once. So my latest version, my upgrade takes less time, increases availability, or minimizes risk of downtime if I have a high availability solution. Database engine. So always on new availability group support application-centric failover. What does that mean? Well, some applications require multiple databases. And if to failover at the same time. SharePoint, for example. If one database failed over, some versions of SharePoint, if one database failed over, we, in some cases, need all the databases to fail over that are related to that application. Well, now you can create an application group that, or an availability group that contains those databases used by a SharePoint. It's easier if we just did it a whole instance, but we can do that. So maybe you've got a web application that needs 3 databases and is really set up, we want those on the same 3 servers. We can fail over those 3 databases, but not necessarily every database when there's a problem. A huge feature for data tier applications, there's now support to do in-place database schema upgrades. Or before, what would have to happen, it would drop those objects or rename those objects, create the schema, reload the data in, and it could take a long time. Now we can make in-place schema upgrades without having to go through that process. A database recovery advisor to help on restores, new event tracings, give more options for developers for tracing what's happening in SQL Server. This is eventually going to be replacing the extended events, is going to eventually replace SQL Server Trace as they're adding that functionality. Distributed replay allows you to do performance testing against a SQL Server using multiple computers. Sysprep supported analysis services. Prior, we had Sysprep support for the database engine and I believe reporting services, where you could build a Windows server, install SQL Server in Sysprep mode, Sysprep that Windows server, and now you have a template for a new server you need to deploy, either hardware-based or more commonly virtualization-based. Using the sysprep support in the database engine and virtualization technologies, depending on the speed of your disks, you could get a new SQL Server stood up in less than 2 minutes. That included the service pack, whatever you had that you sysprepped. Your cumulative updates is slipstreamed and sysprepped. Couldn't do that with analysis services. Now we can. New tools, better SharePoint integration on integration services and reporting services. Better audit. And for data quality services, when we're talking about data governance, your data stewards, as the term is usually referred to, we have much better support for end user data cleansing and data stewarding. Rule-based data cleansing where end users can create rules that says what to do with data when certain events comes up. Very powerful, and then data gets captured and we start building up a data quality knowledge base. Insight and collaboration, we get a new BI semantic model. The old report model went away. That was only worked in reporting services and mostly with Report Builder. That's gone. It's been replaced by this new BI semantic model, which is a unified data model for all the things that we're going to be using. Reporting services, reporting in Excel, analytics in Excel, and analysis services, and performance point scorecards and dashboards and performance point services. One unified model. We'll talk more about that when we look at the analysis service pieces. Support for both relational or tabular application programming interface through the new DAX language and multidimensional. And models can be cached in memory. That's the Vertipack X Velocity, or passed through directly. Again, we'll talk more about those when we get there. Self-service reporting, new improvements to Power Pivot to make it even easier and more powerful for our business analysts to build out and do analysis on data. A Power View thin client. By thin client, right now it's a Silverlight application that runs just in the web browser. They plan to turn it into a full HTML5 application that works with reporting services in SharePoint. The data is built around presentations that hook right back into the data source, tabular data source. Users can build very powerful interactive reports with just a few mouse clicks. Rather amazing. Meant for ad hoc reports, less so for more permanent reports. We're still going to want to use reporting services or Excel services performance point there. And again, support for data alerts, where users can define reports managed through SharePoint. SharePoint is a required component there. All right, database development. If you're a database developer, there's been some nice changes in the way we work with some of these things. So from a Transact SQL perspective, they've added ANSI support for offset fetch, where you can, in your query, say, give me the first 50 rows, then give me the next 50 rows. So query, fetch first 50. Query again, offset 50, fetch next 50. Offset 100, fetch next 50. So you can grab pages of the data, bring that across the network, It allows SQL Server, when indexes are available, to not have to do the full query all at once. It can only return 50 rows, or only send 50 or 100 or 150, whatever you say you want, across the network, when in many cases users don't look at every page. All right, if I go out to Amazon and I do a search on their website for governance, all right, so if I go out to Amazon here and I do a search for governance, all right, it's going to bring back 30,710 results. At 10 per page, that's a lot of pages. So we don't want to bring back all the details about every book on every query, when it's very unlikely that people are going to look at all. There's 16, right? So that would be 1,920 pages. It's not happening. So the offset fetch for applications like that, we can bring back, in this case, the first 16. And then when the user clicks on page 2, bring back the next 16. And they click on page 20, offset by 16 times 20, and then grab the next 16. That's really nice. ANSI standard support for sequences. And we'll see some of those new windowing functions, offset fetch, better metadata discoveries. There's some service broker improvements. The new throw statement that replaces some of the limitations of the raise error statement. A new sequence generator. Sequences were one of the big features that other database management products had that SQL Server didn't. Sequences allow you to create numbers very much like an identity column, except it's a separate object not tied to a single table. So, for example, let's say you're somebody like Expedia or Travelocity, and you create bookings for airline reservations, for hotels, for rental cars, etc. You might have separate tables for each of those types of reservations because there's different data required. But you want to use a single booking ID sequence across the entire set of tables, rather than use separate identity columns where those numbers could be duplicated. Right? We could have an airline booking with one number that was duplicated in the car rental booking table that weren't related. But using a sequence, you can just say, all right, I've got this sequence sitting here, and regardless of which one I want, I just go grab that sequence, and I know it's going to be unique. And then if somebody does do an airline or a car and a hotel reservation, and you want the same booking number on all three, you can do that too. Right? You just grab the sequence, and that value becomes the primary key in those tables. So that's really nice. Better deployment of data tier applications. We can deploy to SQL Server Azure. More options, sequences, spatial types, and indexes are supported. Full schema and data can be deployed as part of the application. And then better development functionality for Stream Insight and the Entity Framework. I'm not that developer in SharePoint or SQL Server, so I can't speak much to that, but there is better support for that Entity Framework there. SQL Server Data Tools. Prior to SQL Server 2012, developers to do database development had to have the full version of Management Studio and Business Intelligence Development Studio. Now what they've done is they've taken the database engine development tools and packaged those into the new SQL Server data tools. This replaces the Business Intelligence Development Studio. But as a free download from Microsoft, you can get the database engine development tools. Where we can develop against the database without having to have a necessarily a client license for the full Management Studio and BIDS. If you do need the BI development tools for reporting service, analysis service, integration services, you will need SQL Server 2012 install. And what that'll do is it will install those projects into the SQL Server data tools. Or if you don't have it already, it will install SQL Server data tools. Integration Services Designer. For any of you who have done any integration services development, this may be your favorite feature in all SQL Server 2012. Undo and redo are actually work now in the Integration Services Designer screen. So if you change a property, delete a task or a component, you can undo that. You undo something, you can redo it. They made significant changes to the XML of the package so that it's actually human readable what's going on in that XML. And they made some improvements to the data flow design. Better ODBC, JDBC, and PHP support help out developers. So that's kind of the big picture. Here's the new features in SQL Server 2012. So now I want to go through a few of those in greater detail. For those interested, we're going to start with the always-on availability groups. If I can find that PowerPoint here. Here we go. So always on and partially contained databases. New high availability and disaster recovery options through always on availability groups. So let's take the following scenario. We had a business requirement for automatic failover of multiple databases at the same time with no single point of failure and possibly redundancy across multiple data centers. In SQL Server 2008, R2 and earlier, this was a very complicated process, right? Automatic failover of multiple databases, you're pretty much restricted to clustering. But that gives you a single point of failure of your disk system and a very expensive redundancy across multiple data centers using geocaching storage. So geocaching storage across wide area network connections and networks, again, can be very expensive. Database mirroring could give you redundancy across data centers, but was a single database by single database failover. We had log shipping. Log shipping allowed you to do multiple data centers. And so database mirroring was just one other data center because we could only have one mirror. Log shipping allowed you to do multiple data centers, but that was more complicated and it didn't have automatic failover back to the primary. So there are, great question, Sam. There are limitations to the availability groups that require Enterprise Edition. There are some parts that are available in Standard or Business Intelligence Edition. So that's another thing, that there's a new Business Intelligence Edition for SQL Server 2012. the easy way to think of the BI edition is it's the standard edition for the database engine. It's the enterprise edition for the business intelligence components. And it's priced in the middle. So for those users, for those customers who, for example, needed scale out multiple reporting servers, they don't have to buy full-on enterprise edition. They can get this business intelligence edition at a reduced price. For availability groups, you can have in enterprise edition up to 4 database copies. You got your primary, or your principal, and 3 secondaries, up to 3 secondaries. That up to 4 requires enterprise edition. All participating in the availability group, synchronous or asynchronous. If you have standard edition, you can have, it's much like database mirroring, you can have 1 secondary and it must be synchronous. Must be synchronous. Now, in SQL Server 2012, we kind of mix and match the best of all of those. We can get multiple database failover, like SQL Server clustering, through availability groups. We just specify what databases are part of that availability group. We get automatic failover through these listeners and these virtual names, much like a cluster. So we don't have to worry about the failover partner connection string like we did with database mirroring. We can have multiple copies of the database, like log shipping. Still limited to 4. Log shipping, we can have as many as we want. But we can go up to 4 with Enterprise Edition. And for that matter, we can designate up to 2 of those replicas, 2 of those 3 replicas, as readable secondaries. Users can actually connect to those secondary servers and run queries. And they may not even know they're connecting to the secondary servers. As part of the connection string to an availability group listener, you can put in a parameter that says read intent only. Whereas so that connection string is requesting if there's a readable secondary available, connect me to that one, and not the read-write server. You can even do your database backups, your database backups, your log backups on those readable secondaries. And so there you can offload that disk I/O and network activity from your principal read-write server onto one of those secondaries. And if that secondary happens to be in a different data center, right, you can be doing a backup there. And when you do a log backup, a normal log backup, not a copy-only backup, when you do a normal log backup on a readable secondary, it sends to the principal that says, hey, these transactions have been backed up, write that backup log event in your transaction log and truncate the transaction log. Very, very cool. Very, very nice. Enhances database mirroring. We get the high availability features of database mirroring where we've got mirrors of that database. It's easier to set up and configure some parts of it. Gives us the readable secondaries, as I mentioned. Support for file stream, file table, remote blob storage, and service broker. These were not supported completely with database mirroring. There's availability group dashboard, wizards, all kinds of things. We get automatic repair of page corruptions, just like database mirroring. That's nice. Now it's built on top of Windows Server failover clustering to do all of the health detection and failover coordination and all of that, all the voting. So we're not limited to the model we had with database mirroring, where we had a principal and a mirror, and we had a witness server. This can scale up beyond 3 servers and is more reliable. There's been a lot more testing on the failover cluster. Mixed synchronous and asynchronous topologies. You can have some of the secondaries synchronized, meaning that 2-phase commit, and they've done some performance improvements there. So it's, as I said, it's like a mix of database mirroring and log shipping here. And so some are synchronous and some can be asynchronous. You can have 3 synced copies of the database. The primary, which is the read-write, and 2 secondaries that are synchronized. And then your 4th one, if you have 4 in the group, is going to be asynchronous. That one has to be asynchronous. You can have multiple availability groups with separate failure paths for different applications. That's just kind of fun. You kind of mix and match things as you need. Here's an example of both where we have our primary here on this server. At the same site, we have a secondary server. At another site, another data center, we have another synchronized copy. So we can get automatic failover. This server fails, this is going to be the preferred failover server. If the whole site gets wiped out, hurricane knocks out power, for example, then we can fail over to this one without any administrative intervention. This would be the secondary for failover if those first 2 are offline. And then we have another one that, and they probably did it this way because the latency across country is going to be higher, so that would increase transaction latency and lower concurrency. Over to the West Coast. And in the event of a really big disaster of some sort, we could fail over here with a small potential loss of data. Any of these 3 servers we can designate as readable secondaries. Excellent question, Sam, and that's something else I was going to get to here. So SQL Server licensing. Microsoft has, for as long as I can remember, had the policy that if you were using a server for high availability only, you did not need to buy a SQL Server license for it. That if you only had one server actively performing business queries or transactions, you only need to pay for one server. That is still the same here in availability groups. But you have to be careful what I just said, right? I said as long as there's only one server actively responding to queries or modifications, then you only need one license for SQL Server. With the readable secondaries, you have to have a second license. Just like if you're doing it with log shipping or database mirroring with the database snapshots. So using database snapshots in Enterprise Edition, you could, with database mirroring, use that as a readable secondary. Here's one where we have an availability group with a couple servers, and we are publishing those databases to a second availability group, where the availability over here in this group is only responsible for failover in this location. These servers are going to handle failover here, But if something takes out this whole site or all three servers, then we can, through administrator intervention, go over to one of these other two locations. So here's an example of two different availability groups. And we're publishing a database from one to the other availability group and using it that way. The way this works is we have an availability group listener that is configured through the clustering configuration, the Windows Server clustering configuration, and it is assigned a virtual name, just like we would through clustering today. So if we have a failover, this is what's going to happen. All of our applications, all of our clients, for the read-write copy, are going through the availability group listener, which is being hosted by all the servers, but only actively responded to by the SQL AG1 server here. When we trigger a failover, so this would be a manual failover, SQL AG1 confirms that it's failing over, informs the Windows Server failover cluster that it's failing over. The cluster says, all right, go offline. Clients are disconnected from that availability group listener. We bring AG2 online. It becomes active on the availability group listener. When the client applications reconnect, they reconnect through the availability group listener to SQL AG2. And it sends notifications to all the other servers to inform them that there's a new primary server that they should replicate from. AG1 will take over as a replica. This is for the synchronous with automatic failover. Now, in a scenario where the server goes down, right, similar process occurs. It's just it doesn't shut down AG1. Clients are going to be disconnected because the server fails anyway. The next server, there's two servers here that can form a quorum. They vote. AG2 is configured as the primary failover server. It's going to start actively responding to that group listener. So the availability group failover, these availability groups do require Windows Server clustering. So the Windows Server operating system needs to be clustered, but you can that does not limit you to just physical hardware. You can set up clusters in virtual machines. Hope that answered your question, John. Let me know if it didn't. All right. Yeah. What happens if we have to move a database to a different SQL server? Switching from availability groups now contain databases. 2008 R2 and prior, all of our SQL Server logins were mapped to database users through login SIDs at the instance level. So we had to have logins duplicated. Welcome, John. We had to have logins duplicated at the second server instance. And they had to be correctly mapped to the database. So we could fail over or restore in a disaster recovery scenario to a new server, users still wouldn't be able to log in. And we had to manually transfer those and run some stored procedures. Also, it doesn't track external dependencies that might exist in your database code. So if you have stored procedures or functions or triggers that depend on external objects, COR, so the SQL Server Common Linked Runtime, or other databases external to that database, there is no tracking of those. Now you can go and query from the DMDB uncontained entities view and find dynamic management view and find out what objects have uncontained dependencies. So while these are sometimes referred to as contained databases, they're really partially contained. They're contained in the sense of the logins. So what we do is we put the database in a contained state by setting database properties, and then we can create users based on Windows logins or with a password. The database itself is doing the authentication, or certainly the domain controller is, but it's trusting that domain controller for the Windows principles. Does not require a login to be created in the master database, which means we can move that database to another server and logins are still going to work. Of course, other external connection objects that may have to move. All right, so first off, you have to turn on contained database authentication at the instance level to allow for it to occur. Don't worry, it's not like you turn this on and every database has to use this in that instance. It just makes the option available. Then you can go to the database and set the containment to partial. And then you can use the SP migrate user to contain system store procedure to map a login, move a login to a contained user account. You can also use the create user with password clause to create a user with a password option. Create user from Windows would be to create a user that's a Windows user. All right, now other considerations working with contained databases. It's a functional boundary. If you're using temporary tables, they are allowed, but the collation of the contained database is used instead of the tempdb collation. It's just a little bit different. Named constraints cannot be used in temporary tables. You can't name your own constraints, and cannot refer to user-defined types, XML schemas, or user-defined functions in your temporary tables. And they do some tricks with, I'm not clear exactly how that works, with temporary tables in your contained databases. Dynamic SQL, you can use it, but it's going to be flagged by the DB contains entities dynamic management view as uncontained. Because it's dynamic, right? And theoretically, some use might actually be contained, and other uses would fail if you move it to another server. So that's only truly defined at runtime. And replication, change data capture, and change tracking cannot be used with a partially contained database because they require instance level items. All right, looks like we have about 20 minutes left. I'll quickly touch on some of the Transact SQL improvements, and then we'll look at some of the business intelligence improvements. So Transact SQL. Query pagination, I mentioned that. The overclause, we get these new windowing functions, sequences. Those are the ones I'm going to talk about here. So query pagination. That example I gave with Amazon, where we might want to only bring back the first page. And then when a user clicks on page 2, go to the next page. Or, depending on how you're building the application, maybe you bring back the first 160, the first 10 pages, because you expect users to be able to do that, cache that, and then just re-render the page on the client side. But then if they go to page 11 through 20, then you can go grab those ones. So the way this works is you use this offset at the end after the order by. You're going to always want to use an order by. There should be some extra spaces here since the slide has some issues with spaces. But you want to use an order by so the rows come back in the same order. when you do this. So then you're saying offset rows to skip. So offset by X number of rows, fetch the next rows. And so these are kind of options for the order by class. Previous windowing methods in SQL Server didn't really optimize well. Right? You had to do funny things with working with the keys or adding rankings and then ordering by the rankings. It's kind of a mess. With windowing. So here's an example where we're saying give us the product key and the order date key and the sales number and the order date key minus the top one previous order key for that user. Yes, there's a query here. Where product key, order date, sales order number, order date key, sales order number, right? So now what we can do is we can say, all right, give us the product key, order date key, sales order number, order date key minus the lag. So the lag just means the previous. There's a lead which says get the next, partition by order key. So this one's a little bit harder to figure out. You're doing your ordering by the order date key. So you're saying get the order date key minus the previous order date key. So basically how many days or how much time between the latest order and the previous order to that. These perform much better using the overclocks. Here's an example of the old method and using the windowing method. And you can see a significant difference in that performance. It makes all kinds of queries, running values, for example, easier. Here's that sequences I was referring to. So we would create a sequence. So a sequence, we're saying, all right, create sequence booking.booking ID as an integer. Fix this, it's a little easier to read. Start with 20,001, increment by 10. Which means every time we ask for that sequence, it's going to, so the first sequence is going to be 20,001. The next is going to be 20,011, 20,021, 20,031. But you can use this number with multiple tables. Right? So all you do is, here's your primary key, set a default as the next value from the sequence. And using this default constraint, it's almost as easy as an identity column. But again, we can take that number and use it across multiple tables. Also eases migration from other database engines like Oracle that may have used sequences in their application. There's some new functions that are kind of nice. Parse functions to try to do conversion. Yeah, so sequences are available in SQL Server Express. You can use them there. Some date time functions to give you more consistent building of dates and times. There's a new end of month function. So you can ask for what is the current end of what's the end of the current month. The mathematical log function now allows you to specify a different log base than the natural log, or actually it's either the natural log or log 10, I forget. Logical choose, immediate if, concat and format functions part of Transact SQL, and new analytical functions. ranking functions and aggregate functions and windowing functions. All available. All right. Let's look at some analysis services. Some integration services improvements real quick. Go to analysis services and talk a bit about reporting services. SQL Server 2012 represents the 4th release of integration services. Technically, only the 3rd. So SQL Server 2005, SQL Server 2008, and then SQL Server 2012. They did not actually update, so this slide is actually wrong. They did not actually update integration services in 2008 R2. One of the areas that did not get updated in that R2 release. So what did they give us here in 2012? Improved usability for developers, deployment configuration management. The big thing, and then this is meant to integrate with master data services and data quality services to give us complete, consistent, clean data for our ETL processes and things like our data warehouse. All right, so an updated toolbox where users can define their favorites, and there's groupings for common. There's a data flow connection assistant to help build out data sources a little bit easier for new developers. As I said, one of the best new features. Love this feature, the undo redo part for developers. Data flow script component debugging. This was a huge pain point as well with integration services development, which I've done a fair amount of. You could debug tasks in the control flow, but not scripts in the data flow. Now we can't. Updated VSTA script environment, support for .NET 4, and one of the other big improvements is 64-bit script environment, and possible performance improvements when working with very large data sets in the script component. With this change, though, just to let you know, this change to VSTA means that ActiveX scripts no longer are supported. If you have a number of ActiveX scripts in your previous packages, you will need to upgrade those to C# or VB.NET script components or script tasks before you upgrade to 2012 on that server, or that package is not going to work. Better performance, all of that. The biggest change, there's a variable window, data flow column mapper, some nice things there. Simplified package format, easier human readable. Differences are easier to see. Now, I do want to mention here that and there's some new changes. There's some new changed data capture and data quality cleansing transformations that you can use. Direct ODBC source and destinations. That's a long time coming. People have been requesting that since SQL 2005. 2008 R2, you could use the data reader and so that the ADO.NET reader and destination. Now we have a direct ODBC source and destination. Part of that is because Microsoft has decided that they're going to do the primary focus now on ODBC rather than OADB. At least that was what was communicated to us a year and a half ago. The biggest change in integration services is right here on deployment configuration menu. They have given us a new deployment model. So we had the package deployment model, where we deployed individual packages and we scheduled and ran individual packages. Now we have the new project deployment model, where we can deploy entire projects as a group to our server and manage them at the project level. So that makes it really nice when we have related packages, because that's typically what happened, right? When we did development, we had a set of SSIS packages that built up into a larger task set. We developed them all in the same project, and then we had to deploy and manage them individually. Now we can deploy and manage them as a project. When you are using that, it uses a new parameter model. So the project itself has parameters that we can then use to pass values from the configuration into the project, and from the project down to variables in the packages. So it will be a slight change to how we develop packages, but in many ways it's a huge step forward. And you can bundle through this ispack file deployment of your packages. In addition, there's a PowerShell interface, there's an object model interface, there's transact SQL stored procedures that you can use to deploy, import, export, execute packages. Right? You can now execute packages straight from stored procedures. Of course, all that's in addition to the old DT exec and DT util that we still have available to us. That is a great question that I do not have the answer to at the moment. I have not yet tried it with SFTP. I'm assuming you're talking about the FTP control flow task. All right, so let's look at some improvements now in analysis services. This is the 5th release of analysis services: 2000, 2005, 2008, 2008 R2, and now 2012. There were changes for all of those. New features in this version is the standardized BI semantic model and the new tabular data model as part of that. No improvements to data mining. So what I really want to focus on in this presentation, just this next 2 slides on the BI semantic model. So what Microsoft wanted to do, they wanted to simplify from a user perspective accessing data. So regardless of the form of the data, we're going to be presenting it to the end users in the same way. So we have our data sources, feed up into our data warehouse in the perfect world, and then we're going to build out our data model either as Power Pivot, just in Excel, Power Pivot for SharePoint, tabular project, or multidimensional cubes, like we've had before in analysis services. Client tools can connect to any of these BI semantic models and use them without any changes because they're using the standard application programming interfaces. So now let me run through the 3 types of BI semantic models that we can create and what our options are. The 3 types of BI semantic models that you can create are Power Pivot workbooks, tabular projects, or multidimensional projects. Your multidimensional projects are the cubes, what we had with analysis services in 2008 R2 and earlier. For Power Pivot, All right, so design type is tabular, meaning we work with tables of data. We're not working with these the same way that multidimensional cube design works with dimensions and measures directly. We can still define our own measures and hierarchies and dimensions, and we're certainly going to want to do that because that helps. But it's in a much more tabular, simplified format that's much more familiar to users with Excel. The development tool for Power Pivot workbooks is going to be Excel 2010 or 2013. Either one works. 2010, it's a free add-on. Works with any version of Excel. 2013, Power Pivot's part of Excel, but only in the Office Professional Plus version. So there is some increased cost there on Power Pivot in 2013. In addition, if you guys are using Power Pivot for SharePoint, please note that Excel 2010 is only compatible with SharePoint 2010. Excel 2013 is only compatible with SharePoint 2013. You cannot mix and match. So if you're using Power Pivot, you're going to have to upgrade your Office clients for the people building those and SharePoint at the same time. And upgrade all your workbooks to Power Pivot 2013. In fact, I had a Power Pivot Power View demo I was going to do at the end here, but I could not get my 2010 workbook to work in my 2013 SharePoint environment for some reason. For business logic, it uses a new language called DAX, Data Analysis Expressions, which is built around Excel-style syntax. It happens in memory, so Power Pivot is an in-memory BI technology. That's the latest rage now. Microsoft's not the only ones doing it. Tableau and many other vendors are doing in-memory BI because it's very fast. It uses a storage structure very similar to the column store indexes we talked about earlier. Deployment, you can deploy Power Pivot, SharePoint document library, if you wanted to share it, or individuals, say through a shared folder. Tabular projects. Next, for tabular, instead of using Excel, we're going to use SQL Server data tools. These are compatible with any version. So what you might do, if you are looking at upgrading from 2010 to 2013 SharePoint, but you may not do Office yet, or vice versa, is deploy those as tabular projects instead. You can build those in Excel 2010 or 2013, either one, and import those into a tabular project, SQL Server data tools. Please note that Power Pivot for SharePoint and Tabular Project require a SQL Server Analysis Services instance installed on a SharePoint server farm if you're going to use them inside of SharePoint. Actually, your Tabular Project doesn't. It just has to be installed somewhere. But we can use that from SharePoint. It is DAX as well, in memory, direct query pass-through. Analysis Services Tabular is the deployment model. And then multidimensional, we got multidimensional SQL Server data tools is how we're going to design those. It uses MDX, the multidimensional expression language, so a different expression language. And it has its own, it's all on disk and memory, MOLAP and rollup storage, build out our queue. Now in terms of the client applications, we have third-party applications that use the standard MDX API, or the Analysis Service API, queries, reporting services, Excel, Power Pivot uses it, SharePoint Insights, that really means performance point services in SharePoint, can all issue MDX queries. And those MDX queries, because it all goes against a standard application programming interface, can run on any of those servers, or sorry, any of these BI semantic models. So you don't have to upgrade Excel or Power Pivot or reporting service or any of these others, right, Dashboard Designer, Performance Point, to work on these BI semantic models, because they just use the standard API. Power View and third-party applications can also be written to use DAX. Right now, however, DAX can only work, Power View and DAX only works on Power Pivot and tabular projects. Power Pivot and tabular projects. There is part of Service Pack 1 for SQL Server that is going to enable DAX queries to run on multidimensional projects. Okay. So that is coming. That is no longer going to be a limitation in just a few months. In terms of the data sources that can feed into these, multidimensional project cubes only work from relational databases. They're designed to sit on top of a data warehouse that's already done the integration of all these systems, right? So these would integrate into a data warehouse right here, and then that data warehouse would feed into your multidimensional project. If you don't have a data warehouse, tabular projects and Power Pivots, they can use those plus relational databases plus a cube that's already been designed, and you can very quickly wrap around a database with this nice reporting semantic model that you may not have built into a star snowflake schema for a cube. The other consideration here is, so when should you use which? So what they're trying to get at here. So what model are you going to use? So it depends on what you have for each layer. Is it a relational database? Then, okay, maybe we can do a full cube. If it's something else, then we're going to want to look at those other things. Where's your business logic? What are the supported capabilities and features? Do you need Power View or not? Of course, that issue is going to go away shortly. Scalability and performance. Power Pivot. Power Pivot is only going to scale to memory in your Excel clients. 32-bit version of Excel, 30 gigabytes maximum of data with compression that's often going to be often get 10 to 15 times compression. So that could actually be 30 gigabytes of data. 64-bit can scale more depending on what the client has, but once you start getting up to high amounts of RAM, and for that Power Pivot workbook, then you start running into clients who won't be able to open. Power Pivot for SharePoint, well, it solves many of the problems of sharing that Power Pivot workbook. Well, SharePoint only allows 2 gigabyte files. SQL Server blob limitation. So we're limited to 2 gigabytes data in that workbook. If you need to scale above this, then you can step up to, this is kind of the way Microsoft sees this, step up to tabular project. This is a full model deployed on server hardware and is limited by whatever memory you put into the system. And remember that 10 to 15 times compression ratio. I've heard about tabular project deployments on a server with 128 gigabyte of RAM being able to process about a terabyte of data. So you can probably scale up to, so this you're reasonably scaling up to 2 to 4 gigabytes of compressed data. So something like 20 to 40 gigabytes of the source data. Tabular projects, depending on your server hardware, you can easily scale from 1 to 1,000 gigabytes. But once you're over a terabyte of data, you're really going to have to start going to a full-blown cube. In addition, if you need data mining, only supported in multidimensional. If you want data mining, then Power Pivot or Tabular Projects is out for you. All right, looks like our time is up here. If you guys have any other questions that weren't asked during the lecture. Yeah, so availability groups, it doesn't really matter what the instance names are. And it's more about you enroll databases as part of that availability group rather than entire instances. You can just add multiple databases to the same availability group. Any other questions? Okay. I haven't heard about any improvements that they really made in that area. I'd be surprised if there weren't a few minor improvements. So parallel processing. This will spark any memories for any other questions. So by default, it will be associated with the instance. It just depends on how you set up the listener and what you include as part of the availability group. Why would you use Power View over Report Builder? Power View can build certain types of queries or certain types of reports much faster and is really targeted for people who don't know Report Builder and doing ad hoc reporting. But there are some pretty cool things that you can do with it. So there's different types of visualizations cards. There's very highly dynamic filtering. Just this few little mouse clicks, and users can change how they're presenting their report. There's also some really nice integration with PowerPoint, including the animations that are part of Power View. Let me point you to a really nice Channel 9. I was trying to do this demo for you guys, but a really nice Channel 9 video that Microsoft produced. It's about 12.5 minutes. You guys can watch on your own time. That really shows you the power that Power View can give you, and some of it is just not possible in Report Builder. I'm pulling up the link right here. can't show it because the audio won't play, but there's the link right there. So like anything with SQL Server, the databases that appear are dependent on the permissions of the user who's connected. And so you can do things like well, I don't know of an easy way to do that, but there are some tricks with views and row level permissions you might look at. Yeah, but so that's a problem with a normal instance of SQL Server. They connect to the instance. The public role is given permissions to query the sys database's view. And it's not something that's unique to availability groups. Theoretically, I haven't tested that, but theoretically you could change those permissions.
Thanks, everyone, for all your questions. And Stephen, thank you for answering all those questions. We had a lot. We're going to hand it over to Frank Chow, who's QuickStart's Area Sales Manager. And if you have questions for Frank or Stephen after Frank shares his screen and shows SQL Server 2012 classes that we offer here at QuickStart, we'll do Q&A after that for sure, if there are more questions. Frank?
Thank you, Brittany, and thank you, Stephen. Hi, everyone. My name is Frank Chow. I'm the Area Sales Manager for QuickStart in Northern California region. It's great to see all the attendees today, so appreciate everybody's participation. I wanted to just take a few minutes and walk everybody through our current SQL Server 2012 curriculum. So let me go ahead and share my screen if I could. All right. As you can see from our web page, our homepage, there are a couple different ways that you can search and get access to all specific classes that you're looking for. For today's topic, SQL Server 2012, as you scroll down under the Microsoft Technology section, you can click on the SQL Server 2012/08 link. What this will do is bring back a page that covers all of our SQL Server 2012 classes, as well as existing SQL Server 2008 training. Some key things to note from this page is, number one, that we've got our classes broken out to what's currently scheduled, and as you scroll further down, you'll see to classes that are by request. So the classes that are under the currently scheduled section, any class dates that you see listed, they are all guaranteed to run, whether it's next week or 6 months out. So to specifically further narrow down the SQL Server 2012 classes, simply go to the Advanced Find section on the top right-hand corner and type in SQL 2012. And what I'll do is separate out just the SQL Server 2012 classes from everything, including the Implementing Data Warehouse class 10777, all the way down to the SQL Server Reporting Services class for 2012. And as you can see, here is the list of all the classes that are currently scheduled to run. So if you're in the need for taking a look at how to implement a data warehouse, by clicking down, looking at the class view, you'll see some important information about the class in terms of ratings of the students that have attended our classes, specifically for the MS 10777, the price, the software assurance eligibility logo, duration of the class. On the right hand side, you'll see the locations that you can select and choose from, and also the available dates. So as you'll note, everything that's listed here, October 21st all the way through February 24th, these are all guaranteed to run, and these are our class times, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And as you scroll down, you'll be able to not only download a PDF of the course outline by right-clicking here to download the target, but also taking a look at the specific sections of the class description from introduction to the Microsoft Certified Professional exams if you're interested in certification, the audience, what this class is, who this class is intended for, what you'll get out of the class when you're completed this particular 5-day training class, some of the prerequisites, what you should know prior to attending the class. This will really help you get the most enjoyment and the most value out of attending this class by having some of this base knowledge. And more importantly, the course outline contained for this particular class, from module to module, with also the details of the hands-on labs associated with this. Currently, we are running some learning specials and promotions for our classes, and let me just kind of walk you through to what those are. If you go back to our homepage, you'll see the logo that says Microsoft Surface or iPad Mini with enrollment. If you click on that, it'll bring you to the various learning specials and the giveaways that we're providing with some of the qualifying classes. So if you drill down further to any of these, you can actually see a list of all the qualifying classes that is included in this learning promotion. And majority of our official Microsoft curriculum classes are eligible for these learning specials and giveaways. As you can see, the list is fairly long, so it's just a matter of finding the right class for you, and then from there, if it qualifies for the learning special, then you'll get some value add out of attending this. And I think that covers everything. Just one more thing, if everybody's interested in taking certification exams and passing and getting certified in SQL Server 2012, we do have Learning Path that will guide those individuals in terms of what they're looking for, specifically to the various job roles, whether you're new to SQL Server, you want to write BI reports, building warehouses, and becoming a BI expert. And this will give you a graphical flow of what classes are recommended and which of the exams are tied to each of these classes and how you can get through the certification paths. And if you have any additional questions about any of the things that you're seeing on the website, you can contact QuickStart directly, or if you are already working with an existing account manager at QuickStart, contact your local account manager and they'll be more than happy to assist you and walk you through the best training options. And that does it for me, Brittany. So back to you.
Thanks, Frank. That was great. So if anybody has any questions for Stephen or Frank about anything Stephen covered in the lecture or Frank and the classes, go ahead and ask now.
You can ask me about some of the classes too, since I teach them. I know those classes pretty well.
Okay, well, if no one else has any other questions, then we'll go ahead and end this tech showcase. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Stephen and Frank. And thanks, everyone, for joining. This concludes the webinar. Thanks.